Well, today we're going to jump into Cornelius Van Til. This is lecture 5.2. And again, this week we are examining presuppositionalism as an apologetic methodology and as a theological system. It really kind of boils down to that in some sense. Let me just take a couple of minutes to introduce Van Til. He was born in Holland, came to America at the age of 10. I mentioned as a young man, I think in the last lecture, and 10 is sort of a young man. So he came to America early enough in his life that he was able to learn the English language very, very well. And so he, according to those who heard him as a lecturer, was able to speak English with only a hint of a Dutch accent. But even though there was not much of a Dutch accent in his voice, there was clearly a Low Countries accent to his philosophy. And that'll come out here as we jump into this just a little bit more. He was a student at Calvin College, and then he went to Calvin University, and then he went to Princeton Theological Seminary to complete his theological training, the Bachelor of Divinity degree, and stayed on at Princeton to earn a PhD in philosophy. At the time that Van Til was getting his education, the reigning philosophical system was idealism. And idealism really goes back, well, it goes back to the ancient Greeks in some sense, but in its recent incarnations, it went back to the work of the post-Kantians. Kant divided reality up into the ideal, that is the noumenal, and the tangible or phenomenal world. And in the years after Kant, his followers sort of divided into two camps. And one camp took the idealistic direction. Hegel was an idealist. Schelling was an idealist. Some of these names may or may not be all that familiar to all of us. So that was the realm in which philosophy was operating at the time. And so this idealistic philosophy is sort of in the warp and woof of Van Til, although he's very critical of it and wants to interpret idealism from a Christian perspective. Because of that, his language is at times hard. And it's a little difficult at times to read Van Til. Probably one of the reasons for this was that when he was in his philosophical heyday, he taught at Westminster Theological Seminary from 1929 to 1972. And in Reformed circles at that time, there were a lot of systematic theologians, but not all that many philosophers. And very few philosophers on this side of the Atlantic who were in sympathy with Van Til, with the exception of his students, who had begun to sort of roll off the presses in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and so on. Most of them were either Van Til fanatics or they were highly critical of their teacher. And so I think that this is one of the reasons why at times his language is cumbersome. You don't really come across, it doesn't really come across in chapter 1, but by chapter 2 we'll see some of that. I'll do my best in the amount of time we have in these lectures to sort out some of the complexities of the language to the degree that I can. I'm not a Van Til authority. Frame is, Oliphant is, others, Greg Bonson, who's now passed on, was certainly a Van Til authority. And they didn't all agree with each other on what Van Til really taught. So that gives you another sort of insight into the fact that there's sometimes cryptic elements in Van Til. So why are we reading this guy? Because he's the father of a movement. And that's why I think it's important for us to get a little bit of taste of him. Now we can cover these first two chapters very quickly because there's not a whole lot here that would be new to us. Some in chapter 2. But chapter 1 is really just sort of his foundational understanding of Christian theology. He sort of gives us a mini dogmatics or a mini systematic theology in in about a dozen pages. he says we must begin from the standpoint of Christian theism as it is taught in the Christian Bible. We don't begin in some kind of a neutral position. And he believes that systematic theology is possible. He's not one of these people who believes that systematic theology is wrong because it is systematic. The Bible doesn't give us a systematic theology on its face. It has to be gleaned from or discerned from the Bible, but he believes in that. And of course, there's some key elements. There are, in my counting, 10 different loci, that is 10 different topics in systematic, but he confines himself to a smaller number than that, and he begins with the word God, or with the doctrine of God. And he says, ask the question, what do we mean when we use the word God? And this really is the starting point for him. If you get this wrong, you're off. You'll never get back. It's like starting on a journey where you get on the wrong road to begin with, and eventually you discover you can't get there from here. So we must begin with a proper conception of God. He gets into the attributes, the incommunicable attributes, that is, those attributes that God never shares with us, like eternity. We are not eternal beings as God is. God's sovereignty, and some of those other incommunicable attributes. And he says we can't partake of those, but we can partake of the communicable attributes, which would include things like love and mercy and those sorts of things that we talk about pretty regularly in a systematic theology discussion. He says also that God is ultimately unknowable, not in a flat sense like the mystics might have said, that God can never be known. No, we can know what God has revealed about himself, but once we have learned that, there's not any farther we can go. We have to recognize that at his core, God is a being beyond us, and that even in the life to come, even in heaven, as we would say, we won't know everything about God. He contrasts transcendence and immanence in a very nice little statement where he says, the transcendence we believe in is not the transcendence of deism, and the immanence we believe in is not the immanence of pantheism. And it's a nice little turn of phrase, and I think that's helpful in explaining his sense of who God is. It has a little section on the doctrine of humanity, or man, as he would put it, the image of God, that we are in the image of God, and even though that image is fractured, it's still there. And this is something that's important to Van Til's overall understanding of the noetic effect of sin. The image has been damaged, and yet the image still being there, which means that there is something within us that God can hearken to and call out of us that eventually enables us to know him as our Lord and Savior. He deals briefly with the doctrine of Christ and his fully orthodox understanding of all these things. He goes back to the ancient creeds, mentions Chalcedon here in this discussion, and it is, again, a brief statement. He's just setting us up. He wants us to know that in the rest of this book, when he deals with more complex philosophical issues, that all of that is based upon an orthodox theological conception. So on to chapter 2. Here he talks about the Christian philosophy of reality, and this is going to get us a little bit into the deeper waters of Van Til. We've been waiting on the edge of the ocean here. I've been to the ocean many places. I've got friends in Tampa, and we went fishing once, and you could wade out a long ways. Well, we've been waiting in chapter 1. We're still going to wait in chapter 2, but it's getting a little bit deeper as we go along. And he says that when we deal with people who are non-Christians, we have to understand their language. And that might be surprising to us. We might think that a guy like Van Til, who's essentially saying, know the Lord or go to hell, would not want to go there, but he does. And I think that shows in his students, Frame and Oliphant that we've read, and Bahnsen as well, that we've not read in this class. He talks about how the philosophers, and I think what what we have to keep in mind here is that Van Til is writing this material at a turning point in philosophical history. Because up till about 1920 or so, philosophers were looking for a unified field of philosophical understanding. Plato wanted to build an understanding of metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and politics and everything else that was one big gigantic system. Aristotle the same way. And if you come forward in history from that point in time and you look at the work of Spinoza and Leibniz, these are late medieval, early modern philosophers, the same thing. The same thing is true of Hegel and of Kant. They're wanting to build these giant systems which encompass everything. Now, about the time that Van Til was writing this stuff, there was a new school of philosophy called linguistic philosophy or linguistic analysis, or as it became known on the continent, logical positivism, which didn't. This was a capitulation to the idea that you can't. Philosophy can't know everything. So all we can do is break things down. We can define terms. We can say what can't be known, but we can't say really ultimately what can be known. So he's kind of a little bit dated in his statement of that, but it's true up until the early 20th century that is what philosophers were trying to do. And he says that ultimately they can't do it. They can't do it because they don't begin with a focus on God. And the primary issue for him is the issue of the difference between the one and the many. And we're going to come back to this with him over and over again. So a brief introduction at this point is, I think, important. It's an old philosophical problem. Is there any unity to the world that we live in, or is it just discrete elements? Or is it possible that there is a unity and the discrete elements are illusions? And what Van Til wants to write is that only in Christianity do you have a definite unity and a definite plurality. You have the one and the many. And he says that one and many is first of all illustrated in the Trinity itself, in that God is one and yet God is three. And then we move from God to creation, and the universe that God has made is one in the sense that it is a result of his creative activity, and yet it is diverse as well. It is the many. Now, because of the fall of man, the many have lost their sense of unity. And what he wants to do, at least in part in his philosophical system, is bring back a sense of the unity that has been fractured because of what he calls sin and its curse. All right, we'll stop right there, and in the next lecture we'll get into chapters 3 and 4 of this book by